Oh, are we supposed to start?
Oh, we're supposed to start. All right, yeah. Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Frank Blue. I've been published 3 times in the Analog now, and that's all I'm going to say about myself for now. So by way of introducing both the magazine and our distinguished editors, I'm going to go through a very, very quick history of the magazine. Starting with editor number 1, Terry Bates, who is best known actually not for giving birth to Astounding, which later became Analog, but he wrote the story Farewell to the Master, which became the film The Day the Earth Stood Still. And I say films rather than films because I'm actually from an alternative universe where the Keanu Reeves version doesn't exist. Number 2 is F. Orland Tremaine, who had the good sense to buy 2 great H.P. Lovecraft stories, At the Mountains of Madness, which has lots of Cthulhu in it, and my personal favorite, The Shadow Out of Time. However, he did not have the sense to read the stories before he bought them. And realizing they were too long, he gave his copy editors free rein to slice and dice and shorten the stories, without asking H.P. Lovecraft's permission, which then caused H.P. Lovecraft to call him that goddamn dung of a hyena, which I do not recommend you saying about your editors. So following the goddamn dung of a hyena, we have the great John W. Kim, who reigned over the golden age of science fiction, published tons of Asimov, Heinlein, Clarke, all those guys. He also changed the name of the magazine from Astounding to Analog. Oh, and that's, Dune. Dune. Okay, number 4, we're almost there, So, Ben Bova, who is a great writer in and of himself, as an editor, he published my favorite science fiction novel, or the story that became a Forever War, and a bunch of other stuff, Ender's Game, a bunch of stuff that won Hugos, Nebulas, stuff like that. And it's an early story by this guy who later became too rich and famous, slowly writing novels to write stories for Analog. Can you hold that for a second? This guy also published a bunch of good stuff from people you may have heard of, Lois McMaster-Bujold, Robert Sawyer, all sorts of great fiction, and also some early stuff by another guy who later became too rich and famous writing novels to write stories for Analog, unfortunately. Can you hold that for a second? Trevor Quachri is the current, I'm pronouncing your name Trevor Quachri, right?
Yes,
Trevor Quachri?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks, Trevor Quachri. So the current editor who's published a lot of really good stuff, and some of these are authors that you may not have heard of, but you should, because the current new generation of writers, Suzanne Palmer among them, Adam Troy Castro, Marissa Lingham, Rich Larson, who, oh my God, the number of stories he's written in the last couple of years is just amazing. Anyway, can you hold that for a second?
And it's not just your name 3 times?
Yeah, Trevor Quachri, can you hold that thing with like the picture of Trevor Quachri on it? Emily Hockaday, who is our current managing editor. She got promoted earlier this year. Congratulations. Before that, she was assistant editor and associate editor. She's been poetry editor since 2013. She also writes her own poetry. She's got 4 chapbooks with a 5th coming out. So that's beach vocabulary. I wrote it down, sorry. Remember. So that's coming out next year? Awesome. So we will ask her about stuff like that. But anyway, so if you could hold that, and you guys could hold those things up like this, and hold up Ben, and yeah, okay. And ladies and gentlemen, the past and present editors of Astounding and Analog.
fullness of time has arrived.
The fullness of time, because I had them sit in this order and they didn't know why.
In Frank, we trust.
Okay, so we all know and love Analog Magazine. There's a lot of science fiction magazines out there, fancy in science fiction. Asimov's Sheila Williams is out there somewhere. Yay! Sheila Williams, editor of Asimov. And but we are here specifically to celebrate Analog. But why is, I know why Analog is special, because it's published like some of my favorite stuff over the years. But why is it special to you? And what does it mean to be working or have worked for Analog? What does Analog mean to you? And go, Stan.
Well, it was a major part of my education as well as my entertainment from about the age of 9. At which point I had been checking all the nonfiction I could out of the bookmobile when it came around to my rural school every month. And one day my father said to me, you ought to read more fiction. I said, I tried and it's boring. He said, you should try some good science fiction. I said, you mean that crazy stuff with the rockets and robots? And he said, it's not all crazy. Try these. And he handed me 3 volumes of Astounding, which his uncle Otto had bound. And he had bookmarks stuck in 3 places in them. He said, read what's at the bookmark. So, 2 wine bounds and a Paget later, I was hooked. And so somewhere a few years later, I found myself starting to try to write the stuff and then to try to sell it. And eventually I did start selling some at a time when I wasn't sure I was allowed to be selling it, but I did it anyway. And so on it continued. I sold quite a bit of stuff and eventually then decided, after visiting my science fiction class of all things, the one I was teaching, that he would like me to replace him when he left, which he did a lot sooner than I expected. And somehow I spent 34 years in this job, and here I am now.
That's awesome.
Well, I'm not somebody who believes in things. I'm not what you would consider somebody with a lot of faith in things or a crusader. But there are a few things. I believe that people are fundamentally all the same, no matter where or when they're from. I believe that pineapple on pizza is an abomination. And I believe in Analog and what it stands for. And to me, what it stands for is it's easy to say science or hard science, but even beyond that, it's the idea that human reason, as embodied by science, is fundamentally a beneficial force. It's something that will make tomorrow better than today. It's optimistic, and it believes in reason and the power of humans to do that and to embrace that. And yeah, that to me is something I believe in. So that's it.
Emily.
What Analog means to me, my take is going to be very similar to Trevor's. What I feel is so special about Analog is the way it looks at problem solving, the way that it holds up ingenuity and people and technology and science as a force for good and a force to move into the future. So yes, very similar to Trevor's take.
And she also agrees about the pineapple.
For the record, I like pineapple.
Sweet and salty.
That was schism.
Okay, so Analog editor. What does it mean to be an editor? So okay, so we have this nice magazine. It's so beautiful, and there's these great stories in it and stuff. And it's like this, nice, tidy, finished package. So how does that actually happen? Because I know a lot of you are writers, would like to be writers. And hello everybody out there in digital media land. I know a lot of you are probably want to be writers too. So, okay, so this unwashed mass of writers are constantly like tossing these manuscripts to you. So how do you pick which ones would get published? How do you choose the stories that go? And Trevor, go.
Well, there are a number of criteria I use. I try not to be overly restrictive about the criteria. One of the first things that you will see, and I should preface this by saying, to be an editor is to reject good stories that you go, oh, this is good. This is not the right market for that. There's a lot of that, and when you're talking about rejections, it's not something that means you should go take that story and burn it and bury the ash. Sometimes there's a very market-aware decision behind it, and sometimes it's a good story, we're the wrong market. But
what do you mean by that, the wrong market?
Well, it goes back to what I was saying about sort of what my particular vision is for Analog and what it represents. So Analog is fundamentally a hard science fiction magazine with some flexibility to come in there from sort of weird angles for things. Not to speak for Stan, but I know one of Stan's hobbies is linguistics, for example. So a lot of language-oriented science fiction made it in with Stan because that was something that was interesting and he could speak to and address with a depth that made it into an Analog story, for lack of a better phrase. Yeah, I'm wildly off track now, but so to go back to what was it? What makes an Analog?
How do you pick the stories that get into Analog?
Yeah,
like
so
you're the gatekeeper.
Well, the first thing I do is you just read the story, and if it jumps out at you, if there's something about the prose more than anything else, if it's readable, if it's enjoyable to read, that's in many ways the first barrier. And then, to be frank, the second thing I do as I read is I go, oh, okay, I like this. I like the writing. This is enjoyable. Where's the science? I immediately begin looking for sort of a science core that is integral to the story on some level. And then, sort of corollary to that, I go, okay, does the science more or less work? Do I have to, do we have to do any edits, revisions, buoy it up in some way? And if it meets the two of those, it has a good chance of being an Analog story. But those are two difficult criteria. They can be more difficult than you realize. And then I guess kind of the third unspoken one, which is something I personally appreciate and will easily push something past the yes, I've got to take it boundary, is if it manages to do both of those things from an unexpected direction, if it manages to tackle not necessarily talking about tropes, but if it manages to be a story where the science is integral, but it does it in a way that I don't see coming or is not well-trod ground, that carries a lot of weight with me. So those are probably the big things I look for.
So you like to be surprised in the story?
Who doesn't?
I like to be surprised.
Exactly.
Yeah, like I'm hoping to be surprised by Stan's answer to this question too.
But
surprise me.
There are surprises that you don't like. I once read a novelette from a very good writer who I liked a lot, and I liked it all the way through to page 41, and on 42, it collapsed.
Oh no.
Into a completely unexpected but utterly disappointing ending. And that's a rarity, but it can happen. Another thing,
Did you ask him to change the ending, or did you?
Unfortunately, the ending did grow logically from what went before. It was surprising, but it was still thoroughly disappointing.
Oh.
And it didn't lend itself to fixing.
Oh.
It might have worked for some other editor, but another factor that I have to mention is that even if something is the right kind of story for this market, doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be able to use it. We have a certain number of pages to fill every month. It's approximately, what is it now? 200 something.
208.
Okay, 208 pages to fill exactly every month. Whether we have nothing that we're excited about or we have 2,000 pages of material we're excited about, we're going to use 208. So in a particularly good month, a lot of very good stories might be rejected simply because there's no room. Now, since the amount that we get, and I read all my own slush, I think Trevor does too. This meant that I necessarily learned to read most of it extremely fast, looking for something to jump out at me and say, I've been interesting. And if that happened, I put it aside to read a bunch of other stories that struck me the same way. Otherwise, mere literacy can look like literary excellence. It's surrounded by things that don't have any. So first I would try to read everything very fast, then I would put aside things that interested me. And the things I was looking for were largely the kinds of things that Trevor was looking for. First, I wanted to get caught up in it. And in fact, the first test that the story had to pass is, would it let me speed read it? If I get interested in something, I can't. I slow down and read a couple of magnitudes slower because I'm paying attention to every word. And then I'm looking for things like how well does this story work as a story, how well does the science work, how essential is the science to it, and what kind of, then I get into the really slow mode when I'm really about to buy it, and I'm looking for anything that a reader might conceivably complain about in it, and see if that complaint is valid, and if so, what needs to be done about it. In that case, if the story passes all those tests, I can't find anything to complain about, I might just go ahead and buy it. What more likely happened, though, would be that I would find that I liked it a lot, but certain things bothered me. I would never say to the writer, fix this and this way, and I'll buy it. I would say, this is what bothers me, what can you do about it? And if the writer could find something that both he and I liked at least, he or she and I liked at least as well, then I would buy it.
Okay. I'm going to pick up on that idea in a moment, but Emily, you edit the poetry, and that is your complete purview, and whereas Trevor edits the fiction, and so science fiction poetry has always seemed like this weird thing to me, because it's like, okay, you have a phrase like, I don't know, he flew like he had wings of an eagle. Like, in a science fiction story, it's like, he could possibly have the wings of an eagle. And, but in poetry, it's like, wait, is this a metaphor? Is this real? It's like, so tell us about, like, picking poetry. Like, what things?
You're definitely onto something there with the metaphor. It does make finding science fiction poetry kind of tricky because metaphor is real in poetry and in science fiction. But if you think about it that way, it also lends itself to poetry, science fiction. So really for the poetry, I go with my own personal taste and whether it falls into an analog place. So obviously there's no fantasy poetry. If I see fantasy poetry, right out the window. Easy to just like slide that off my desk. I will say something that I would love to see more of is just straight science poetry. Because analog is a place for science and science fiction. Obviously, we have our alternate view column by physicist John Kramer. We have fact articles every month, editorials. There's a lot of room to play there with what analog is, and I find that science poetry works a lot better for me than science fiction poetry.
Y'all heard that?
I think it does, and I think it brings a new direction to the poetry in the magazine. Science fiction poetry often falls into the problem of, this is the summary of a story. Well, that's not a poem. It's the summary of a story. So that, I would say, is the biggest pitfall of what I see in the submissions for the poetry.
Okay. Oh, by the way, I have no idea what time it is or how much time we have. So Jason, oh, by the way, thank you, Jason and City Tech for inviting us and organizing this whole thing. So if you could go like this, or like this or something when we're close to being out of time, that'd be great.
Over.
Okay, thanks, Jason. So, okay, so Stan, you had mentioned, okay, if there's a good story, but there's some things that don't quite work for you. So one thing I've always wondered about, or one thing I've always heard about, John W. Campbell, is that he's on one end of the spectrum of editors where he worked very closely with Asimov, for example, in developing the laws of robotics and like some of the ideas in Foundation and things like that. And then on the other hand, I'm not talking about you specifically, you have editors who basically say yes or no to a story and like that's it. And so there's this big spectrum. And so I'm wondering like where you guys are in the spectrum with both fiction and with poetry. And what your thoughts are about that. I'm trailing off Stan.
Where am I in the spectrum? Well, put it this way, I learned my original editing techniques from John W. Campbell.
Oh, okay.
I stole a lot of them shamelessly, which means that I will very seldom micromanage or micro-edit a story. I will often complain that something about the way the plot develops is not logical. There is a rumor circulating that John W. Campbell liked to micromanage. Actually, this is very perplexing to me because in my experience and all that I've heard about from many other writers I've known who worked with him, one of the things that I liked most about him was that he was one of the least micromanaging editors I've ever met. He did, however, often say, this bothers me about the way your story developed. This is not logical. It wouldn't work that way. Or it's a limp ending. It's not going to satisfy the reader because it reaches the ends and just say, eh. But he also was famous for throwing out ideas that he had thought of. He was a veritable fountain of ideas. And he would suggest it. He did not say, write it up this way and I'll buy it. He said, here's something you might like to play with it. And I have done some of those. I also have at least half a dozen left in my files that I haven't yet figured out what to do with. But
how many years have those been sitting in your files?
A whole lot. At least one of them I gave to either one writer or a pair of other writers, and they did something. I decided I wasn't going to get around to it. But I am certainly not of the school just say yes or no to stories as they come in, because a large percentage of stories can use some improvement. I was always very careful, or as some writers put it, I was notorious for what they call vague rejection slips. I did not tell them how to fix the story. I said, this is what I think needs fixing. And I left it to the writer to figure out how to fix it. I had two reasons for this. One was that I thought that the writer would like to have the story be as much, have it be their story rather than mine. So I would just let them figure out the solution. And for me as an editor, this had the fringe benefit that by doing so, they learned more about how to construct a story that worked, so that they would be less likely to need this kind of back and forth in the future.
Did you ever get to a situation where you're like, okay, so there's a problem with the story's great except for this problem, and you know, what can you do about it? And then they try and fix it, it's still not fixed?
Oh yeah, some stories go back and forth several times. In fact, one of the most dramatic, and for a while, sad cases of that I ever saw was a novella that I got that I thought had a really great idea, but it just kind of fell flat in the end. And I wrote the author a long letter about why. In fact, I found out that he lived near a place, near a convention that I was going to, so I suggested we come and we talk about it over lunch.
Oh, wow.
And we did that, and he wrote the story again, and it was, if anything, maybe a little worse. And we went through the process again, and the story got a little worse. I said, I'm terribly sorry, but this still isn't working, and I don't know anything else to suggest. A few months went by, and I got another big brown envelope from this author, and I looked and saw it had the same title, and I groaned. And it had a cover letter that just said, here, try this. And it was exactly what I've been hoping for all along.
Yay! Emily, do you ever ask for like edits or rewrites and stuff in your
I do. I think it's a little easier with poetry because there's a lot less to edit. But I've definitely sent poems back saying, can you think of a different title? That's the most common place that a poet goes wrong, and as a writer myself, I know how hard it is to title things, so I get that. Sometimes I'll suggest options, or I'll say something along the lines of, and then usually the poet will come back with the right title. Mm-hmm. Or I'll say, like, let's cut this whole stanza, and I always say I understand if you don't want to, and feel free to go elsewhere with it, but I think the poem would be a lot stronger. A lot of poets will write a first stanza that's really just scaffolding for the poem. It doesn't need to be there, but it needed to be written to get the poem out on the page. And I'm pretty happy to chop those off and let people know. And I feel that in doing so, I'm letting the poem live its best life.
She asked me for a change in a poem, and I'm pleased to report that she didn't tell me how to do it.
But eventually you took it.
Yes.
Oh yeah. Well, that's nice to. This is nice to hear because I feel like I as a newbie writer, we're writing this stuff and it feels like there's this tiny target that you can hit that's that's acceptable, and everything else is no, I'm not gonna publish it. So maybe that target is slightly larger if my story is good but has a flaw that's fixable. Right, Trevor?
Yes, that is accurate. There is a little bit of a gray zone where I think anybody who's looking at something, be it a story or a fact article or a poem, looks at what it would need to get to a usable state. And it can be a little nebulous. Sometimes you just have to weigh. You say, there is a world where I can see the perfect version of the story, but that's going to take a lot of work. And there's a very frank assessment there where you go, I don't have time for that. However, sometimes you go, this actually is very close, and that makes it more usable, and I am more likely to take that. So there is a zone there where you're just constantly going, how much would it take to get this there? But it's not a complete get it in one perfect
Yeah.
And in fact, along those lines, Campbell almost never suggested any detailed changes to me. He did, however, say things like, I like your basic idea, and the beginning is fine, but the other 42 pages have got to go. You've got to take it in a whole new direction to make it work. Or one time he said, you've got a lovely idea in this, but the wrong plot for it. And what he meant by that, I had a vision system which I had given as a medical anomaly to a little boy, and he quite correctly pointed out that this wasn't really plausible. It would require too radical a rewiring of the nervous system. He said, but you could put this in the Mars rover robot that some friends of mine are working on at MIT, and that could have some really interesting consequences. He didn't say anything about what those consequences might be, but he left it as an exercise for me. And that led to the first story he bought from me.
Oh, wonderful. So I want to talk about this a little bit more. We kind of touched on this, but again, in the spectrum of editors, we have some editors like Gardner Dozois, who is a longtime editor of Asimov's, and he had written award-winning fiction before he became editor, and he resumed writing, after he was editor. And then on the other side, you have people like Gordon Van Gelder, who is a longtime editor of fantasy and science fiction, who was asked, are you writing anything? He's like, no, I'm just editing. And so is it hard to, what's the decision of writing and editing at the same time? How does that work? How do those two things fit together? And we'll start with Emily, because she has a chapbook coming out that's called, what is it?
Beach vocabulary.
Beach vocabulary. So, editing versus writing.
Well, I just basically have compartmentalized entirely. Like, my poetry writing is off in its own world, and then my editing is off in another world. I don't write science fiction poetry, So that is probably a factor in keeping things compartmentalized. And then when I do copy edits on the fiction, that's of course entirely different genre. So yeah, I just keep them totally separate.
Okay, so you don't have to actually worry about like contamination or somebody accusing you of like stealing one of their ideas or anything like that. If it's like,
No, ideas are cheap. We all have more ideas than we're ever going to get around to doing anything with.
It's true.
Trevor, are you writing?
No, I'm much closer to the Gordon Van Gelder end of the spectrum, where editing really gets a lot of that creative drive, where you think to yourself, oh, maybe I want to write, and then after editing you go, no, I don't.
You have to deal with editors then.
Yeah, no, and they're the worst. No thanks. There have been moments where I've done a few things here and there. Going on almost a decade ago, I wrote a horror western screenplay that actually had an agent was actually shopping around, and they were in talk, blah blah blah. But it was about as far removed from science. Yeah, it was about as far removed from science fiction as you could get on purpose. And that was fun, but it was not something that
What was the title, by the way?
It was called The Immunes.
The Means.
The Immunes,
Okay.
yeah, and that's on video now. But yeah, there it is.
Wait,
yeah,
you
so-
said it's on video now?
No, I mean I just said.
Oh, it's on video.
Exactly, it's on-
Everybody out there in the
Yeah,
digital
no, it's
universe
not
is like,
like the Asylum straight to DVD thing. No, it was never made.
Not yet.
Yeah, I think I'm done with it, but that's fine. But so sometimes I enjoy the process, but I do my best to keep it removed, and it creates a different set of expectations too, where I like to think of myself as more a neutral arbiter there, that I have no pre-existing expectations as a writer, that maybe the way I figured out how to solve a particular problem is the right way, that I'm there to just magnify the author's voice, their specific voice. The flip side being that I felt, and this is entirely self-imposed, but I felt that without being a writer beforehand, I didn't have some of that pre-existing legitimacy, that when I gave people who were professional writers feedback on their stories for why something didn't work, that the obvious answer is, well, who's this guy? I mean, aside from the guy who's not buying your story. So in the beginning in particular, I tended to give out a lot more detailed rejection letters because I felt like I had to justify and explain my opinions and positions on things. Over time, I realized that takes a really long time to do, so I cut that out pretty quickly. But in the beginning, that was a factor. So.
You had a much more reasoned way of making that decision to write less detailed letters than I did. But when I started off, I inherited 6 months of stuff that Ben Bova had bought. And there were these were paper manuscripts in those days. There were vast piles of them on my desk. And I too, having come from teaching a course where I was teaching students in a way that was based on my interactions with Campbell and Bova, author-editor relationship, where I did have all my students write a story, and I wrote detailed feedback on every one of them. And I was doing it on way too many of them when I started editing the magazine, until finally, Vicki Shaka, my associate editor, said, you know, if you don't start using those form letters more, you're never going to dig out.
So you inherited stories that Ben Bova, the previous editor, had bought but hadn't been published yet. So did you re-edit those to
No.
say or you just let them go and let them get published?
They were already processed. They were in the pipeline. It was probably 6 months before people saw an issue that was actually all mine. And for most of those months, very little of them was mine. However, from the very day my name appeared on the masthead, I started getting letters about how I was destroying the magazine.
Did you get that, Trevor, when you took over?
Oh yeah. I still do, but I just what are you gonna do?
Well, it's either destroy it already or it's not.
Right, exactly. I mean, in some ways, that actually, I find a little depressing, the idea that it could be this slow poison decline, whereas if I was going to destroy it, I would want to just nose just immediately just right to the ground.
You would know how if you wanted to.
That's exactly what I mean. Just 3 months
I
in,
could have
just-
done it.
Just completely blow it up. If that's the way I would do it.
But it's too late now. You're
Too
not
late-
gonna blow that.
too late now, I'm committed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Emily, did you get anything like hate mail like that? Wait.
Not really, no. I think
And
I'm
now it's too
just
late.
below the radar, like, yeah.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. We're doing okay on time?
Yeah.
Okay. So, all right. Analog hard science fiction. In science, we look at stuff, we look at what it is and not how we think it should be or what we think it is. So, John W. Campbell, great editor, bought some great stuff, worked with awesome authors and developed them, and also said some like racist, fascist stuff that, okay, is part of the public record. Sometimes.
Don't forget nuts.
What?
Dianetics.
And promoted Dianetics, which.
And
I
Intro.
can't deny the racist, but I think the fascist is wrong.
Okay, how
I
about that?
think, I read the definitions of fascist after Jeanette Ning gave her remarkably ungracious acceptance speech for an award she probably should have declined the nomination for. And she started off by saying John W. Campbell was a fascist, which simply is not true, but it's such a neat sound bite that I think people are going to be going around saying it now as if it were true. And I think this is a bad thing. It's a bad thing that happens to be very fashionable right now. People are being trashed with sound bites, and they're proving that Shakespeare was right when he said, "The evil that men do lives after them, the good is often interred with their bones." And there's an awful lot of interring of bones going on right now. It's a bit of cultural sickness right now.
Trevor, you were, okay, you, after Jeanette Eng, who won the Campbell Award for Best New Writer, in her acceptance speech, as you mentioned, basically brought these issues as she saw them, which obviously some of us disagree with, some of us agree with. Anyway, and then Trevor, being a current editor of Analog, had the responsibility of dealing with this situation. And
Better you than me.
Tell us about that.
Okay. Yeah. So, well, that I mean, this is spurred on by that conversation. That decision fell to me. It's something that I like the science fiction genre, but I don't always go out of my way to follow the goings on in the field that closely. But in spite of that, you know, over the past couple of years, I've been aware of the conversations around Campbell and his legacy, for better and for worse. And so there was a lot to weigh there. But going back to saying, being aware of that conversation, this is something that I knew on some level was only a matter of time before something definitive some sort of definitive decision had to be made. And it's not often in my nature to poke any kind of bear, so I kept sort of procrastinating and thinking, well, you know, let me mull it over a little longer, let me mull it over a little longer. But eventually that just wasn't really a luxury anymore, and it was something that I should have probably made a decision on even earlier. But
I was actually surprised how quickly you decided what to do.
Yeah.
From my perspective, I mean, from years, it was probably a lot of agonizing, but.
Actually, I think the one unfortunate thing I see about the timing is that it looks too much like you're endorsing what Jeanette said, which was wrong in so many ways.
yeah.
So, well, tell everybody what the ultimate decision.
Well, so the ultimate decision was specifically renaming what was previously the John W. Campbell Award for Best New Writer, and renaming it the Astounding Award. So, I mean, that was the conversation and the specific decision. Part of that process was sort of looking at it a little bit like the Kobayashi Maru from Star Trek a little bit, where it is a no-win situation from the perspective of an editor. So you simply have to look at it almost from a purely moral standpoint. And from that direction, I had to consider that ultimately his name attached to the award distracted from the purpose of the award, and that was something that I don't think the award, even after, even were Campbell around, I don't think that is something that he would have wanted, that it would no longer have been serving that purpose. And that to me was kind of the guiding star, and that made the decision very, I don't want to say easy, but clear.
I actually like the new title, the Astounding Award, because it feels like it emphasizes what happened in the offices of Astounding in terms of like the relationship of developing new writers, especially, which Campbell was very good at. I see Emily nodding her head.
I really like the new title for the award, and I think it was the right choice.
Do you have more thoughts on that?
It's a complicated situation. I obviously feel very grateful to Campbell for this magazine. The Analog is wonderful. I feel so privileged and lucky to work on it, but he said some terrible things that I also don't want us to be associated with. And I think changing the name to the Astounding Award keeps the spirit of the award alive, keeps the spirit of raising new writers up alive, and also it does encompass the history of the magazine, so he's not left entirely out.
Yeah, I like that. I think it's a good decision.
Yeah, I would just sort of add on and say that the other thing that was important to me as part of this was saying that although Campbell was part of the magazine is also larger than just him. It incorporates people like Emily, it incorporates Stan, it incorporates Ben, and having all of those people and their contributions involved in a vote was important to me. So that's sort of why I.
Yeah, and one reason for his name on it was that it's a new authors award, and one of his kind of specialties was discovering and cultivating new authors, and all of us, the rest of us, since then have done that too.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Thanks, Trevor.
Yeah. My pleasure.
So we've got a couple minutes. How many? 5 minutes. Okay, so that might be like 1 or 2 questions from the audience. And who's got a question? Since long before your sun burned hot in space, I have longed for a question. That's from Star Trek, if nobody. Nobody like. Oh, yes. Thank you.
That's a good question. I find learning about the sort of back end, of choosing. I only get magazines in this form. I've never worked in sort of publishing in that way, so I find that really interesting. How much, I guess, as a person on the outside, like, have any rejections gone horribly wrong? I mean, you told some endearing stories of really working more closely with writers, but has that kind of thing backfired, inviting someone to meet you, or them knowing where you would be at some specific event and kind of
Being called a goddamn dung of a hand.
Right. Have you had any of those kind of stories?
Any of you?
I only two brief ones. Is there was one story that I said, I like this story, not quite right for Analog, but I do like the story, and I see that it's actually a play that you're sort of it's a science fictional take on another how to keep this big on a popular movie that had just come out maybe the year before. I said, it's kind of a science fictional riff on that, and the person would
Was not
bristle
happy
with
with that
They were-
comparison.
don't know if they just objected to the comparison or objected to me noticing the comparison, but the reality is it is what it is.
Was this in the context of an acceptance or a rejection?
Oh, it was a rejection.
Oh, okay.
You know, which
So-
also, you know, right, there is context there.
Oh wait, are we out of time?
Okay, you started a little bit. I was going to give the mic to the next question.
Okay.
And then the other one was someone had sent a story, and the tail end of this is probably not my most professional action, but someone sent a story, and we have what is fundamentally a not science fiction rejection, which is, you know, the story's fine, but it's not a science fiction story. It's fantasy or whatever. It doesn't meet our criteria of science fiction. And they sent back just a scathing, you know, this is science fiction by, and again, they were wrong, but they sent in their scathing response through the submission system, so I sent them another, this is not a science fiction. I mean,
Oh, I think that was very professional.
it's not.
How could you resist?
That's hilarious. Stan, any horror stories of like being held up knife point or anything?
I don't remember any quite like that. I did occasionally get one. Since we had so many submissions, we had to use a printed rejection slip for most of them. And I got one indignant letter from somebody who said, John W. Campbell would never have sent me that printed rejection. And I had to write back, John W. Campbell wrote that printed rejection, and he sent me lots of them before he sent me anything else. I also remember one case of a story about which I had very mixed feelings about rejection. The nice thing about the story was that the characters were so vividly drawn that I could picture all of them as I read, which is a great thing in a story, except that those characters were the entire cast of MASH.
Oh, no.
Emily, do you have
There's
anything?
a question.
Oh, okay, another question. Another question.
I was just curious how you chose the cover art, or if you commissioned it for like certain stories, or I know there's several stories that also have kind of the ink art associated with it.
I have answers to that. People often sort of assumed that the cover was going to go to the best story in the issue, whatever that does. No, the cover story commonly goes to the story that had the most vivid images in it that lend themselves to good art. So when I was thinking about a cover story, as I read a story, I tended to form pictures in my mind. I am both a verbal and visual thinker. And as I read a story, I would find pictures of the action forming in my mind. I'd look at them and say, now whose style is that in? And that's what I would ask to have do the art. But when people were asking, how do I get a cover story? Sometimes people would ask me this, they've sold several stories, but none of them got a cover. My answer was very simple, write pictures.
Yeah, +1, agreed.
Okay. Do we have time for another question? One more.
Trevor, you mentioned having 208 pages to fill in every issue. How much of an inventory of fiction do you keep around at any given time? And how do you decide what goes into any specific issue?
Oh, good question. Well, I learned from Stan to, yeah, okay. I learned from Stan to keep a pretty tight inventory. So when I took over after him, I used all of his stuff immediately, and I think I only bought myself 2 months maybe of leeway to get my feet going, get my feet under me. It is tougher now that we work more with double issues. So I always try to keep a buffer of 1 solid issu's worth of content, but truthfully, not much beyond that. And then as far as what goes in, that's really a gut reaction. There are some stories that I think will fit the very loose themes I have for an individual issue. So if something is scary, I'll save it for September, October. You know, something's funny, I'll use it around April. But there's not that much beyond that. Sometimes I'll put together an issue and I'll see, oh, there are too many stories that kind of are on a similar, there's some sort of pattern. And sometimes it's just thematic, but I'll go, I can't use both of these for whatever reason, and then I'll kick something back to the next one. But usually I try and keep it pretty tight, and I use what I have on hand with with a handful of things that I specifically bought or saved for a specific reason or issue. With the 90th anniversary issues, there were more things that I bought and then sat on with the intention of using at some point this year because I liked them or I thought they fit. But otherwise, I don't generally tend to operate like that.
Oh, so I have a sort of, but not really related question. Okay, so when you submit a story, like, we don't hear anything from you for like 4 months.
Yeah.
So what happens in that 4 months? Do you like read the story and just sit on it, or do you just not get to it for 4 months? Or
It depends on, it depends on a bunch of stuff. So I also tend to, and this is a holdover from when I started, there's, the editing process involves a lot of working without a safety net. You simply sometimes, you might not have something and you just hope something will show up, and that petrifies me, predictably. So I tend to read things in bigger batches than my predecessor or did. So Stan pretty much kept a very tight rolling progress, whereas I will let things build up to a solid month and then read that. And by the time, counting sort of the previous, by the time something is built up to that month and then sort of made it through the reading, and I read the prose and then I read the slush, and then everything kind of goes through, I make the decisions, and I get the form letters together and they go to someone who's probably Ray, who actually sends the stuff out. That's the process.
okay.
So yeah, that's it.
All right. Do we have time for another question or no?
I need to clean.
Please. Okay, so I don't know. I don't know how to close this except for like saying like you're all wonderful.